Hello, this is Colin.
And this is Nigel with another Encore's Year podcast.
So we release one of these, trying to do one of these every week. And as always with these things, if you enjoy it and you want to see another one, just hit subscribe which is in the bottom right-hand corner.
And go on.
Sorry, Nigel.
Go on.
Nigel, okay. We've been practicing, Jane, you can see. So today we've got wonderful conversation with Jane, and we want to find out all about her life and what she's done and what's gone on.
Okay, I'll start, Jane. What did you do before retiring?
I sort of retired gradually. So it wasn't as suddenly one day I was working full time and earning money and then on the Monday I suddenly wasn't. I had a pretty varied sort of a career. After graduating, I worked for NatWest Bank. So I was in the city and commuting, doing the daily 9 to 5 up in the city, and continued with that and enjoyed that very much. Then I moved into motherhood and also into working abroad. So that was because my husband was posted abroad. So ended up having sort of a couple of stints abroad. So that was a sort of bit of an interruption to the NatWest career, although I went back to it afterwards. I worked part-time for NatWest for a while. And then there was another interruption to my career, which perhaps I'll go into a little bit later. And I had got 3 children by then, went into school as a helper and ended up becoming a teaching assistant, decided that going back into NatWest was more than I could cope with at the time, and also slightly lost my motivation for working for a big company. So I worked as a teaching assistant, which was a lovely little part-time job that combined beautifully with bringing up the children. It was local. I could walk there. And then the teachers in the school I was working in kept saying to me, why don't you become a teacher? Why don't you become a teacher? And I was saying, no way. I can see how awful it is. It's so stressful and so busy, etc., etc. But as you might have guessed, eventually I was persuaded. So I then became a teacher for the next 12 or 13 years. And then I wanted to go part-time from that. And I had on the side another part-time job, which was as a children and families worker for my church. So I was employed by the church to do work with families and children, which of course linked in beautifully to my part-time work as a primary school teacher, which was in the church school linked to the church where I was working. So I was this sort of bridge between the school and the church, and then moved to retirement, firstly from teaching, but kept up the children and families work, which was a lot less stressful and worrying, until I then sort of finally retired from paid work at the end of December 2019. So that's it in a nutshell.
So that's very varied, from NatWest to family to children to, teaching.
One morning, 45 years old, and thought, I'm maybe about halfway through my life. I had this sort of optimistic idea I might live till I was 90. And that was when I thought, right, come on, you need to make a decision. You're either going back into banking, which by that time had changed beyond recognition with computing coming in and all that kind of stuff. Look into doing the teaching thing. And so the teaching thing fell into place very, very easily. I already had a degree. I didn't have to go back to college. I learned on the job. I was able to do a year in the school that I was already working in, worked alongside a teacher, went to some day release stuff and got qualified teacher status that way. So it was a very easy way to change career midway through my life. And absolutely, yes, I was older than lots of the new starters, but there were plenty of people like me who were coming into it from other sort of corporate careers. I think it can be quite appealing to people to go into teaching after they've done their sort of stint in the corporate world. It seemed to be like that for me anyway.
Yeah. Okay, so you come to the end of 2019 and you officially retired. What were the first 6 months like?
My sister lives in New Zealand. So I disappeared off at the end of January 2020, and of course flew into Singapore, which was in the throes of COVID and lockdowns and social distancing, which we had no idea about here. Went to New Zealand, had a wonderful month, flew back to the UK, and COVID struck, lockdown struck. So the first 6 months were sitting at home and enjoying the garden and being in lockdown and experiencing what everybody else was experiencing, which was something extraordinarily different from what we'd had before. So in a way, it was a very enforced rest and an enforced stop. We all struggled a bit with that time, but it was also quite a nice time for me because all my various offspring, who by then were all obviously living independently and far away, came back to stay with me. So I had the family come back home, which was actually quite enjoyable, to be honest.
After lockdown, what happened in your life?
Then, and it's interesting. I've been thinking about this, and I thought, in a way, I'd never planned a retirement, but in the way that my career, as I've described, was a bit of a patchwork, different parts of my career that kind of still quite nicely fitted together and fitted in with my family and my community. Then when I went into retirement, that sort of patchwork idea continued, and I was still using the skills that I'd had prior to retiring in what I took up after retiring. So I never really, apart from lockdown, I never really experienced a sudden change in my life. It was a bit of a change to my income stream. I suppose that was the main thing I noticed. but from the point of view of filling up my days, I still had a lot to keep me occupied. For example, it was at a time when there were many refugees coming over to this country from Syria and then Afghanistan. And the school I'd been working in had received some children from those places. So I offered to go in and do some English and some catch-up classes with English and conversation classes with them, which I did. And then because of lockdown, there were these things called the COVID catch-up program, which was for children that they felt had fallen behind during the period of time when they were having to learn from home. And school asked me if I'd go in and do some what they called COVID catch-up. There was a little budget, so they paid me some pocket money for that. So it was still using my skills from my career, really, from my teaching, to pepper my week with teaching work. Then the other thing I did, which again was kind of linked into the teaching, it was a hobby that I took up before I retired, partly as thinking, oh, this might be a nice hobby to have when I retire, although it wasn't quite as explicit in my mind as that. So I took up beekeeping about a year before I retired from school, from teaching, and did some evening classes, practical training, got quite involved in the Beekeeping Association, and actually acquired some bees of my own. So by the time we were in lockdown, I did have bees to look after, which was an activity you were allowed to do during lockdown. I think it was considered to be an agricultural activity or something. And then one of the things that our Beekeeping Association does very, very well, and had been doing for years, was an education program of inviting the local schools in the area to come into the apiary where the honeybees are and learn about the bees and insects. And so I sort of started by helping out with that program, which is just in the summer. It's just a summer term thing. Got more involved in that. So again, using my teaching experience and skills that I had in my hobby, which has worked quite well.
Would this work with apiary, do you feel this is your biggest achievement?
No, I don't think of it as an achievement. No, I don't really measure my life in achievements. Certainly one of my greatest pleasures, and it is rewarding. I think it is good when you retire to think of it as a starting time rather than an ending time. And I do think that I was probably doing that instinctively, that I was looking to start new things rather than seeing my retirement as a sort of an end to something, which I imagine might be very different if you've had a full-on career, full-time in one company, maybe for many, many, many Monday to Friday, and suddenly you stop. I should think that sort of ending feeling is quite strong and could be perhaps shocking. I don't know. I can't say, but for me, it was more of a time of, this is retiring so I can start things or develop things that I was already doing.
Yeah, can I just ask you, if a friend of yours came to you and said, look, I'm retiring at the end of the year, what advice would you give them?
I'm thinking of it as a positive pathway ahead, not as everything's going to end. And I think probably planning a way in which you can further your interests, beyond your career. And as I say, take the skills that you've acquired or the interests that you've developed into new spheres, or maybe just into spheres that already exist for you. So it's a really gentle transition rather than a precipice.
I think
Had 2 part-time jobs, but then stopped one part-time. That gradual transition, I think that was greatly helpful. And I think I would definitely recommend if it's possible. And I think that can be such a big help, because then you can build in a few sort of more hobby type activities into that time, and it just gets you used to not being reliant on your Monday to Friday career as the only thing that fills your life or fills your week.
I like the idea when you talk about, the advice of using your skills. So you've got all these skills you've developed, and then you're doing something different, but it's not really completely different because you're already using those skills. You're carrying on with those skills.
Yes, and then of course it does inevitably means retirement means you've got more time at home, you've got more time to see family. My church was always important, when I was working, but when you become a retired person, it's amazing how churches grab you and say, you could do this, or could you do that? And I think that could be the case for any kind of community organisation. Suddenly they're looking for people who are still relatively fit and healthy, but free from paid work. And so certainly I took on things that were new, linked into the community and linked into the church. I mean, one example, beekeeping is a fantastic hobby, but it's really a summer hobby. And I quite like that, because I quite like getting to September and thinking, I can leave that behind, leave the bees happily and move into winter, and then look for different things. Sometimes when it's dark evenings and stuff, it's quite nice to be a little bit more home-based. But one thing I helped out with is our homeless shelter, which is a winter night shelter. And that's run in this area by all the churches together. And we offer accommodation to the homeless through the winter, and they're always looking for volunteers, whether it's to cook meals or to go and sit in the evening and play chess with a guest there, or do the breakfast shift, which I've done quite often because I don't mind getting up early and going and cooking breakfast for them before they're kind of turfed back out onto the street again. So that's a winter activity. So that fits really well with the beekeeping, which is my summer activity. And for me, I like it because it gives variety. And I'm quite that kind of person. I quite like different things. I get a bit bored if I've got to do the same thing the whole time.
I like the word you use, patchwork. And I suppose all our lives are in some way or another patchworks, but you seem to have benefited enormously from this. So what's next for you?
Yes, it's a good question.
Final
I
question.
mean, as I say, I don't particularly have a plan about what's next. My week has become much more tied up with looking after grandchildren, which obviously I didn't have any when I retired. They didn't exist, but I seem to have managed to have acquired 6 grandchildren in less than 5 years. So I have a life that is pretty tied up with kicking a ball around the garden, or hunting for ants under stones, or whatever it might be, planting seeds in the garden and digging, and all the things that little boys love to do. And I'm very happy to do with them. So 2 days of my week really are granny duties, which is quite a significant proportion of the week nowadays. But they will go to school. One has just started school, and it's amazing the difference it makes. So, within no time, it's like a flash, and suddenly they're in school, and I won't be needed in the same way at all once they're occupied at school. It'll be more like school pickup and maybe taking them to football or tennis after school, rather than actually having them from breakfast time onwards, which is how it is at the moment. And so I envisage for the future having a little bit less of the granny duties to do as they get more involved in school. That's what everyone says.
I wouldn't bank on it.
And there's always the school holidays, aren't there?
I wouldn't bank on it.
The school holidays, it suddenly hits you again, big time. Yeah. But I think always wanting to learn something new is quite a good objective to have. And in fact, just the other day we were talking at the beekeepers about they've got a nice laboratory at my beekeeper's place, and they bought some new microscopes. And I've never ever done science. This is one of the reasons beekeeping has appealed to me, because I went to school in the old days, in a girls' school where if you were good at French and English and history, which I was, then you didn't really do science. You weren't allowed. So I didn't do any science at school, hardly. The bare necessities. And taking on the beekeeping, just the initial evening class, it was just wonderful the way I thought, actually, I quite enjoy science and that kind of thinking and learning about science. And obviously, I've had to teach science in primary school as well, which was quite a good learning curve for me. And now there's just going to start some new microscopy classes, which for me will be something completely new, because I don't think I've ever looked down a microscope, not properly. So that would be fantastic. Hopefully, I'll be able to do that maybe this coming winter. I'll learn how to use a microscope and dissect a bee.
Jane, when we started talking, how much you're doing, how many different things you're doing.
Thank you.
And I've really enjoyed this and listening to you. So thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, and I think lots of good advice that we can take and everyone
You're
can
very
take
welcome.
from this. Really, really good fun. Thank you. Right?
So
So is that it now?
Well, bro, I think we've met a very interesting lady here. And yes, I think that's it, bro.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, Jane, once again. And it's goodbye. It's goodbye from me.
Right? And it's encore and out from me.
Encore and out, Colin.
Well, Nige, wasn't Jane just inspirational in all the things she gets involved in?
Just extraordinary, but it didn't start out like that. It sort of came bit by bit by bit, and there was more and more and more.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing, then, I really can relate this, when she used the word patchwork. She said, my life has been a patchwork of activities. And if you look, within that patchwork, she's doing things for the church. She's doing things with refugees. She's doing COVID support. There's a huge amount of things in the patchwork.
And we sort of teased them out in a way, didn't we? Or she reflected and then brought them out, but they weren't at the front of her mind.
Yep.
That was extraordinary. And what a list of things she's been involved with, which is extraordinary. She did say, try and learn something new in retirement. And I thought that was a very good one. I think it's always good to sort of break out of what you've been doing and try something new.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the way she talked about skills. So obviously, she's done Nat West. She's a fully qualified teacher. She's got all of these skills. And in some way, she weaves them into her, new life.
That's right. And also she changed career midlife, which was an interesting one.
Yeah, 45 years old, complete change.
That's right. And one thing that I enjoyed listening to was she had a hobby before retirement, which she kept open afterwards and got much more involved with, and that's beekeeping. So that's a good idea. And that involves children, education, science, an awful lot to it. There's a lot. It's not just grabbing honey out of the beehive.
Yeah, absolutely. So she's going to be the expert to tell us about microscopes. So another thing she wants to learn,
Right.
And the final thing, the grandchildren, COVID, no grandchildren. Now, 6 years later, she's got 6 grandchildren. And I know she's hugely involved in those. Another wonderful advice and wonderful part of her career.
And when they start going to school, I think she'll be just as involved.
Right. But the great thing is, even if it doesn't, she will, with her patchwork, she'll build up something else.
I know. Yes, she's got an awful lot going on.
Yeah.
So I'm very impressed.
Yeah. So big thanks to her. As always, if you've enjoyed this, if you hit the little subscribe button, then it means every time there's a new one of these, hopefully every week, you'll get a little notification. It'll cost you nothing.
Subscribe button. Sorry, it sort of pinged when you said that, so I'm not sure I came across. Subscribe button.
Yeah, sorry. Just on the right-hand side below here, just hit subscribe, please, and then give us a thumbs up and all that sort of stuff.
Another
Make us feel
great
good.
interview, Colin.
Yeah. Okay, Nige, that's it till the next one.
Encore from me.
Encore out.
And out. Thanks, Carl.